Good morning, delegates, and welcome back. In this session, which is focused on the institutional arrangements of the Howard Government, I want to explore the distribution of ministerial portfolios and related issues during the Howard Governments by talking with the two people who were perhaps most fundamental to such decisions, the Prime Minister, Mr. Howard, and the Deputy Prime Minister from 1999, Mr. John Anderson. While both of them need very little introduction, especially to this audience, it would be churlish of me not to give a brief outline of the key facts. Mr. Howard was elected as the Liberal member for Bennelong in 1974 and became Australia's 25th Prime Minister on this day in 1996. He was, of course, Australia's second longest serving Prime Minister, losing office in 2007. Mr. Anderson was elected to the House of Representatives in 1989 for the seat of Goyder and became Nationals leader, and Deputy Prime Minister from 1999 to 2005. He left Parliament in 2007. Gentlemen, thanks very much for joining me. Let's see if we can inject some light and colour into a topic that is generally neglected. I want to ask you first about the issues that surround selection of a ministry, especially the ministry in 1996. In March of that year, only 3 of your coalition parliamentarians had ministerial experience. Yourself and John Moore at federal level, and you will have seen John Moore's quote about you, Mr. Howard, a moment ago, and John Fay as Premier of New South Wales. And the coalition enjoyed a 45-seat majority in the House and a pool of 131 members and senators on which to draw. So, first of all, in the most general of terms, what do you look for when you begin to select a ministry at this stage? Personal characteristics, professional backgrounds, experience. Is there a growing problem in this area when politicians are increasingly career politicians? Mr. Howard?
Well, can I answer that last comment first?
Sure.
The answer to that is yes. Mm-hmm. And it's more at a state level than at a federal level. You asked what are the criteria? Well, I can think back to 96 when Tim Fisher and I had our post-election discussions. It was obvious that we had to pay regard to the shadow portfolios that people held. And there was a very large amount of carryover. It was clear that Peter Costello was going to be the Treasurer. It was clear that Alex was going to be the Foreign Minister. I had in mind restoring Ian McLaughlin to the Cabinet, the front bench, and I made it as Defence Minister.
That's correct.
And equally in relation to what I might call the Bush portfolios, there were clear responsibilities in transport, in agriculture, and the like, and trade, where Tim Fisher himself had an enormous capacity and interest in trade, and of course trains as well, but it was a bit hard to put transport and trade together. But so a lot of that fell into place fairly easily. You weren't starting with a blank sheet of paper. And Tim and I had remarkable ease in negotiating not only the proportions in the ministry and the cabinet, and I've often said that these things are like many things in politics, driven inexorably by the numbers. And the National Party was clearly entitled to a certain proportion given the number of seats it had won. And of course, Scott Prosser indicated a moment ago, the Liberal Party had won 26 seats in 1996, but any suggestion that the Liberal Party would seek to govern in its own right was absurd. And it got no change from me because for 2 reasons. Firstly, it would have been a breach of faith, both with the public and of me with Tim Fisher, because we campaigned as a coalition. And secondly, I knew that the capacity numerically to govern in our own right would only last 1 term, that there had been some miracle gains, grateful though I was for all of them, in 1996 that I knew we wouldn't hang on to. So that was out of the question, and we restored the traditional arrangement that naturally the leader of the Liberal Party would be the Prime Minister and the leader of the National Party would be the Deputy Prime Minister. And the first thing I did on the 11th of March, which was the day that the new government was sworn in, when I went to Yarralumla and saw the then Governor-General, Sir William Dean, was to present to him a letter from Tim Fischer confirming the restoration in government of the coalition, which had obtained years earlier when the Fraser government was in existence. And we followed all of the arrangements by and large, the institutional arrangements, allocation of portfolios, Deputy Prime Minister, etc., that had been followed first by Menzies and McEwen, Menzies and Patten, and then Menzies and McEwen, and then by Fraser and Doug Anthony. So the institutional arrangements that we set in place weren't difficult because there was ample precedent, and above everything else, there was an extraordinary goodwill. And I trusted Tim, he trusted me, I trusted Johnny's deputy, and Peter, the four of us, Peter Costello, of course, was deputy leader of the Liberal Party and putative treasurer. That level of personal trust. And, you know, quite frankly, we were delighted to be back in government. And we weren't going to let any petty-foggy arguments over the allocation of portfolios interrupt that sense of delirious excitement.
So I can assume from that you were reasonably content with the choices that you'd made for your shadow ministry in the years preceding. But I also note that there's a certain sort of generosity in your style of distributing portfolios to some people who had been, let us say, political enemies of yours within the Liberal Party. Is that that's really more a function of your personal characteristics, I would say?
Well, yeah, that's nice of you to say that, but I was also, and you were talking obviously of John Moore. John Moore had been critical of me, and I understand that, but that was the past in 1996. And on top of that, John had a great deal of business experience. He'd been a successful participant in the financial community, particularly in Queensland, stockbroker, etc. He understood business well, and he brought to the cabinet table a very valuable understanding of business. And it was all in the past, our differences, except just as Menzies in the case of Page did the same thing. Not that I was particularly instructed by that, and but I suppose you can draw that analogy, and I think those things are absolutely essential if you're going to get a government off to a good start.
Mr. Howard, can I just continue for a moment on this vein of a selection of ministers, given events of recent days? And that is, it's very difficult to frame this question.
Well, go ahead.
Well, no, I'm trying to be fair to everybody concerned, because here's a case of someone who has apparently a skeleton in the closet. It is alleged, for which there cannot be, I understand, a police inquiry because of other circumstances. How do you have a sense of the general background of the people to whom you appoint as ministers? Do you have a sense of their personal backgrounds?
I think that varies. Some you know well on a personal basis, some you don't. I don't think it was nothing in that general area, if I can give a very general answer to your rather circumspect question, that had any reason to interest or excite me. Beyond that, I don't want to comment on current matters. I'll leave that to the current Prime Minister.
Yes. And I didn't want to draw you
No,
too
I know
far
you
down
won't.
that track.
Yeah, I understand.
Yep.
You can ask me any question you like.
Thank you. Again, I gather from what you said that there wasn't really a hammering out of positions between yourself and Tim Fischer as Nationals leader.
No, could I just say, in the interest of historical accuracy, the greater disturbance about the allocation of portfolios really occurred within the Liberal Party, because one of the things that the election result threw up was an alteration in the balance of Liberal representation from Victoria vis-a-vis Queensland and New South Wales. We had secured massive gains in Queensland and very heavy gains in New South Wales. And although the vote in Victoria had held up very well, we didn't have many gains there. We in fact lost 2 seats from recollection because of redistribution and picked up a couple of others. So not in any sense of slavish state balances, but I had to pay some regard, and obviously, to the enhanced representation. And I was very conscious of the fact that one of the many reasons why the Keating government had got very unpopular in Queensland was that Queensland's representation at the cabinet table was, to say the least, modest in the Labor government. And I think that hurt Keating in some respects, hurt him, and obviously had to accommodate people like John Fay. I mean, John Fay had been the Premier of the largest state, and he'd come in the Parliament, and the idea of him staying on the backbench or being a parliamentary secretary, I think, was ridiculous because of all his experience.
Sure. And can I just ask, because of that very large majority in the House and that very large pool of members and senators, how do you keep restless and ambitious backbenchers occupied? Because of course they can't all be ministers or parliamentary secretaries.
Well, it's always a challenge, but it's not a new challenge, and you can't ignore, and you ignore it at your peril, the merit principle. You don't completely choose a ministry on merit. You've got to pay regard to Senate, House of Representatives balances. You've got to pay regard to state balances, and very importantly, obviously, you have to worry about gender balance. Now, my first cabinet had 2 women. I think by the time I was defeated in 1987, the cabinet had something like 4 or 5, which was for a cabinet was close to being a record. Now, once again, the merit principle comes in, but equally you can't ignore, you mustn't ignore gender representation. You can't. But I didn't find that difficult because the 2 women that I had in my first cabinet were extremely capable. Amanda Vanstone and Jocelyn Newman, they were both remarkably capable people, and there was not much difficulty in them, no difficulty at all in being chosen completely on merit.
Mr. Anderson, can I turn now to you to look at the coalition ministry in the first and second Howard governments? You served as Minister for Primary Industry and Energy in the first Howard government, and in the second ministry you served first as Minister for Transport and Regional Services, before adding to that the role of Deputy Prime Minister in July 1999 on the retirement of Tim Fischer as Nationals leader. So you inherited a coalition agreement and a somewhat reduced Nationals party room after the 98 election. So as a minister in that first Howard government, and here's your chance, how did you respond to the way a coalition cabinet functioned, the level of cooperation and respect between ministers and parties, for example?
I think you can divorce what happened in government from the platform that had been built in opposition. And after John became leader, there was a determination to leave no stone unturned to be worthy of the trust of the people in what turned out to be the February 1996 election. And there's nothing like an awareness that you've failed very frequently and your people want you to actually get back into government, to focus your minds and make you get on with it. So there's a sense in which there was a continuity there. Nonetheless, as I look back on it, it was a pretty salient and blunt reality that not many of us had had any previous government experience. So we were very heavily reliant, particularly on the Prime Minister, to some extent on John Fay and John Moore to, if you like, help us understand how to pick up the levers of power, run a department, and so on. It wasn't especially easy. Three of us were under 40, it's worth remembering, the Treasurer, Michael Wooldridge, and me. And I felt very keenly the extraordinary burden of a portfolio that had not been a Labor priority. And we had a real problem in regional Australia with drought, particularly in Queensland. Queensland's always politically powerful, I suppose, and keen to leverage any influence they have, if I can put it that way. We had the massive problem of the wool stockpile. They had serious dissatisfaction with basically every statutory authority in the place. So that capacity to work together depended heavily, I think, on the Prime Minister's patience, probably in the early days. It wasn't necessarily an easy time. We seemed to be heroes for a while. I sometimes tell the story that only about 3 weeks after winning government, I flew to North Star, which is one of the most productive agricultural areas in Australia. And they gave me a standing ovation as I got up to speak before I said anything. 12 months later, my good friends up there were ringing up saying, oh, you know, the government's not doing so well anymore, John, and you're in trouble, and, you know, everything from guns through to the fact that it hadn't rained, people were in a sour mood. They were tough times, and you know, I think it was probably a very fortunate thing we had some experience. That's one of the great problems if you don't get a bit of a cycle of governments over time, I suppose. If you stand back and you're really objective about it, you end up with a side that's totally unprepared. The opposite trap can be you get into government before you've had time to really put down deep roots and train people up.
You had clearly reasonably good support from your department, would you say? And of course, by this time, the role of political advisors had become quite important, I think, growing since about 1984. So presumably you had some of your own people, but also the department was assisting you as you thought appropriately after 12 or 13 years of Labor government?
Well, I asked the Prime Minister for a change. I wanted a different secretary, and we brought back a fellow who understood the bush, and I found that invaluable. I found a couple of the lead secretaries. A lot of the people in the department were graduates of the University of New South Wales in those days, and they had an amazing amount of practical experience
there you go.
in rural and regional matters, and a lot of them, they did. There's no two ways around it. And so I was probably quite well served by my department, I think, in many ways in those early days, and I was very thankful for that. One of the headaches for me was that I'll never know who was responsible. I suppose it was a joint decision, but Tim Fisher and John Howard put me on the Expenditure Review Committee, and that was exhausting, very long hours. And you mentioned the slight diminution in our numbers in 1998. We've got to remember the impact of One Nation. And I've been quite open in recent years in saying that I think one of the problems with dissatisfaction in Queensland that sort of fueled that movement, put wind in its sails, was the fact that Tim was overseas for extraordinary amount of the time with his trade responsibilities. And I was very preoccupied in those early days with ERC. We weren't out on the hustings enough. And it's tough, frankly, from a National Party perspective. I don't want to cry poor about this, but just getting out there, barnstorming and communicating because of the sheer time that it takes when suddenly we're massively preoccupied in government, trying to get a handle on a portfolio where there were problems everywhere, where there was massive amount of restructuring that needed doing. There was ERC, I felt often totally compromised there because perhaps a bit like defence, you know, which we decided to quarantine. The problem with rural and regional Australia was that they felt they'd been the subject of a lot of cutbacks because it wasn't an area of priority for the previous government. So I'm painting a picture of, I guess, a pretty tough couple of years when we kicked off. But what happened really, I mean, I think John Howard deserved huge credit for the courtesy he displayed around the cabinet table. He must have often felt terribly impatient probably quite cranky at times with the way things were going. As people picked up the ropes and as we faced incredible challenges, there was a drop-off in our poll performance after the first 12 months. After the first budget, we seemed to be more popular than ever. Then it started to slip away. But one way or another, you know, what happened was that there was a recognition we were all treated with courtesy. We were all given our say, and trust started to really, you know, it had always been strong, but it started to build, and there was a sense of we're in this together, so we'll stay in it together.
Okay, let's turn to the second Howard government. You've become leader of the Nationals. You're fighting for both the influence and the visibility of your party. What were the sorts of pressures you were facing from your Nationals colleagues in Parliament and from your coalition partners on the other side? Were there, in other words, major decisions where the national interest trumped the Nationals' interest?
Remarkably few, in my view. By then, I had learned a great deal about how to present a case and how to appeal to the sense of patriotism in rural and regional Australians. And it was always a great theme that I ran, that our job was to be, to the best extent possible, the greatest extent possible, full partners in government, to build a strong government that worked for all Australians. You know, our first responsibilities are economic and strategic and military security. Did you run the place well? And of course, by then we were seeing the fruits of some of our labours. Interest rates were coming down quickly. The dollar, and I was able to always, throw up a few clever charts that showed that the dollar was under deregulation in a properly run economy, averaging lower levels than it had when it was managed. Now, farmers always loved that in those days because they're exporters. And we had a reasonably powerful story to tell. There'd been the successes on the waterfront, which had been something the NFF had taken on very keenly. And the other big one was, it was a dream selling the GST in rural areas because we had effective leadership from the farm bodies, and they were with us. They were out there on the hustings. And I remember going to a group of farmers, John Howard laugh, you may remember, I might have told him the story, to explain what we were going to do with the GST. When in some areas it wasn't popular, and I stood up and gave an impassioned plea, mounted all the best arguments I could, and Paddy McGuinness had been asked to speak, and he got up and he said, well, that's as good an explanation as you'll ever hear for the reasons for reforming our tax system. And I don't claim any great cleverness on it, but my 2 points are, the bush was on side, and whatever I said fell on receptive ears. So the mood was very different. We were becoming more confident, subdued by the election results. We knew we had to perform, but as Christine Wallace said in her very comprehensive coverage of the year 2000, by then people sobered by 1998, but conscious that we'd not lost sight of our objectives, was getting on in a way, with government in a way that left grandstanding and even puffery behind. I rather appreciated her words, as a matter of fact. And I think it's true. And of course, you see, the Prime Minister had great authority because he delivered a second win. It was a close run thing, but we were back despite all the tough things we'd done. One of the big ones for me, of course, was Telstra. That was a problem for me. It was a very big problem because I was out of sync with a lot of my own membership. I actually believed, probably more strongly than many people in the Liberal Party, that the government could do better things with the money. And I also was very conscious, the illustration I used to use is, look, I'm the Minister for Transport. You cannot register a car in Australia if I haven't signed off on the Australian design rules. We don't own a factory. We don't design cars. We don't even own a lot of cars. But you can't do it unless I sign off. We set the standards. You don't get your licence. We set the standard. And the same with airports and airlines. I presided over a massive regulatory regime there. But we didn't own not many airports. We didn't own an airline apart from the Air Force. The conditions of licence meant that you had enormous power. And for the life of me, I couldn't see what the problem was if, and I know there are people who still disagree with me strongly, but in saying we can have our cake and eat it on this one too. You just set tough licensing conditions and be prepared to be reasonably fair with the CSO, and then you can do some really good things with that money. Probably reflects my Scottish background. I always thought being careful with other people's money mattered. and that was taxpayers' money.
Sure.
So that was an interesting one for me, because I was the odd man out probably in my own team. I don't know whether I've ever said that to John Howard, but that's really what it boiled down to.
You spoke very generously about Mr. Howard's the development of trust that happened within Cabinet under Mr. Howard's leadership. But can I ask you whether you recall any differences in the way that Mr. Howard chaired Cabinet meetings as the years progressed?
Look, I think the whole Cabinet became more comfortable with one another. Look, I just think the camaraderie developed over the years. It was an extraordinary thing to think that I don't ever recall it leaking, you know, and if it did from time to time, it was probably more people just being a little incautious rather than sort of, you know, hey, you know, here you can, whatever,
Sure.
during the time that I was in it. So there was that great sense of unity and of purpose, and trust builds trust. You know, it's an incredibly important thing. And I suppose I grew up in an environment where if there's one thing my father was very strong on was, you know, your word needs to be your bond. So I appreciated what I felt was an environment of trust. Look, the other thing that had changed, I'll be really frank about this, was that the whole rise of One Nation, you know, I had a couple of Liberal mates who used to give me a pretty hard time the first time round. Oh, is the bush burning today, John? And then one of them said when it was burning, well, you were right, it was. And the sort of the slightly derogatory term that was thrown at me occasionally from senior Liberals are rah-rahs, regional and rural Australians protesting again. All of that had gone completely. And there was, as I look back on it, I actually think that the mood of the Cabinet after we'd won in 1998, and we had a very proactive agenda. The great debates about the GST were yet to come, but it gave us something to believe in and to fight for. You know, I think it was pretty remarkable, really.
Mr. Anderson, do you think there are any portfolios that in a coalition government should be allocated to the Nationals as a matter of course?
I think now and in the foreseeable future, the agriculture is the critical one, because so much of the party's ethos and beliefs and sort of heritage and so forth is rooted in you know, it being once a farmer's party. Now, when the party was set up, probably 25% of Australian workers, people who had a job, either owned a farm or worked on one, it's probably now no more than 2 or 3%. So there's been a massive shift, but it is very, very much our heritage.
All right. Look,
beyond that, I'd have to say no. I mean, remember, for example, that Ian Sinclair was Minister for Defence, and after the 2001 election, you know, I mean, I must remember I was sort of thinking I wish I could follow in Ian's footsteps, because it was a portfolio that really fascinated me. But you know, the Bush didn't like that idea at all, as I recall. So the Bush itself. Yeah. Our membership had very strong views on it.
I think it's a ministry that perhaps eats up and spits out ministers, so perhaps it was a useful one to avoid. If I can turn to Mr. Howard.
So by the way, for what it's worth, so does transport. I was talking to a very senior guy in transport the other day. He said he's had to deal with 6 transport ministers in 4 years or something, whereas I was there for nearly 7.
Okay. Can I turn now to Mr. Howard? Do you, Mr. Howard, have views about that last issue I raised, the allocation of portfolios between the coalition parties?
Oh, I think what John said is right. An effective coalition, although it shouldn't be a formal part of the arrangement, has to acknowledge the historic significance of agriculture to the very essence of the National Party / the Country Party. And I don't think it's likely ever in the future. It would depend on individuals, but I think it's unlikely ever that the Treasury would be other than held by a Liberal. It was held once by Arthur Fadden, but they were different times, different circumstances. Before I say any more, I can't let reference to the first government go by without acknowledging the extraordinary forbearance and understanding of both Tim Fisher and John Anderson, and the then National Party Premier of Queensland, Rob Borbridge, on guns. That was an issue that caused immense political trouble in sections of the bush, and the way in which they fought the good fight, the three of them, and at federal level, particularly Tim and John, was something I've never forgotten. Overwhelmingly, they did it because they knew it was in the national interest. And it was one of those issues where there was tremendous support for what we were doing in the cities, particularly amongst women, but in sections of the country, areas there wasn't. And I have no doubt that what we did on guns was part of the circumstances that led to the rise of One Nation. And they do deserve enormous credit. And can I go back to the thing I said right at the beginning? Just imagine what would have been the stresses and strains in the National Party if right at the beginning of our term of government we'd mucked around with the coalition understanding. And it's just only has to be stated to be obvious. But what they did then was very praiseworthy. It was the right thing, incidentally, I mean, but nonetheless they did it, and they deserve enormous credit for that. And it did create a lot of problems in some of their seats. Seats like Wide Bay in Queensland, which was held by subsequent National Party leader in the case of Warren Truss, held Wide Bay. It was very, very difficult because in those days we still had in Queensland three-cornered contest. And one of the things you've got to remember when you're talking about the coalition in government and in opposition, that relations between the parties varied enormously from state to state. And in the end, what stopped the Joe for PM campaign was the decision of the New South Wales Nationals to campaign against Joe for PM candidates in New South Wales, if that were to eventuate. And that shouldn't be forgotten when we're going through the history of that stressful time.
Mr. Howard,
I think, I'm broadly speaking, what John said is right about allocation portfolios and of course so many of these things now that although there are still sharp differences in some areas between the city and the regions, there's a blending and a merging where people with a strong city background have got regional profile and vice versa. And you know, I've never forgotten way back long before I was in Parliament when Harold Holt drowned. There were a lot of Liberals in Sydney who said, "Oh, gee, wouldn't it be good if McEwen could be recruited to become Prime Minister?" Because they admired him. They admired the strong support that the National Party leader had given, particularly on foreign policy. You've got to remember that in the 60s, politics was largely dominated by national security issues. And people like McEwen were rock solid in support of the foreign policies, particularly over Vietnam, which was a controversial issue of the Menzies and then Holt governments. Now that's wandered away from your question, I'm sorry, but I think it's part of the context.
Sure. And I think part of the purpose of these retrospectives, Mr. Howard, is to learn more about the ministry and the way it worked under your leadership. So all of this is very much to the point. I want to turn now to really changes in the ministry, because there were a large number of changes in the ministry. And to you both, in a sense, as leaders of your respective parliamentary parties, did you get together regularly to talk about the performance of ministers?
I don't recollect us having got together as a matter of routine and arrangement. We talked about it when there was an issue, and by and large, that didn't operate all that often. But when it did, we did something about it. But we certainly didn't sit down on a regular basis and go through the list saying, you know, he's struggling or she's doing very well and deserves promotion, and what about so-and-so on the back bench? And obviously there were occasions when John must have torn his hair out about a performance of a Liberal minister, and I must have torn what was left of my hair out about the performance of a National Party minister, but it wasn't something we did as a routine, no.
I assume it's not an easy conversation to talk to a minister you've appointed and tell them that they're not performing particularly well. Can you bring
No,
those circumstances to mind?
well, look, I had a rule in relation to personnel appointments that both the good and the bad had to be done by the boss. If you were going to let somebody go, you had to front them. Now, sometimes that proved to be physically impossible, particularly after you're reconstructing a new ministry in '96. I remember some people who had been in the shadow cabinet I couldn't include in the government, and some I had to give them portfolios they didn't like. Now, because I was doing the whole thing, it was impossible to do that face to face, but later on, when somebody was being let go, I tried to tell them to their face why. And it's difficult, it's extremely difficult, but it always works better if you are doing it face to face, and it never works when they read about it for the first time in the newspaper. And that I had seen happen in earlier governments, and I resolved to do everything I could in my power not to allow it to happen while I was in the chair.
Mr. Anderson, can I pull you gently into a contemporary debate? In a coalition government, Nationals have the privilege of being represented at the cabinet table with only a small proportion of the national vote. There are 8 Nats in the second Howard ministry, 6 in the third. In recent times, and perhaps also during your time as leader, some national MPs have grumbled about the relative importance, by which I mean the lack of importance, of the ministries allocated to Nationals. Are you aware of those complaints in your time as leader, and do you think there are good grounds for that view?
I think in our time there was a feeling that we had the portfolios that belonged to us in the cabinet. With the reduction in numbers, one member in particular felt particularly aggrieved because he felt that he should have retained his, and that the person I retained in his place, who in my view had a greater claim to it, should have been the one who was hung out to dry. So you do get those tensions. But broadly speaking, no, I think we felt that we had the ones that we wanted and that were appropriate and that the Bush wanted. I have seen the more recent speculation. I disagree with the idea, by the way, that you'd somehow or rather judge the importance of a ministry by the amount of money that it's responsible for spending. I would have thought Treasury, for example, was pretty important, but it itself doesn't spend it oversights, but it doesn't have, it's not a big spending portfolio in itself, neither is Prime Minister and Cabinet. I mean, these things are skewed by the massive amount of money, for example, welfare portfolio spends, even defence. So I think the issue more is one where, and I've made this point to the current leadership, it's really about making certain that you are really seen as performing in the areas that you have responsibility for, that any claim for greater representation is well founded on the basis of performance, both in terms of the numbers, but also in terms of thought leadership and contribution to the government in terms of its philosophy and direction. And I think the other side of that coin, I suppose, I'm probably sounding a bit tough here, but it is the way that I see things, is that the party has got to, look, we do face these challenges from right-wing splinter groups and individuals and what have you. If you go out and say to your people, vote for us and we'll get you this, that and the other that you need in your electorate endlessly, you're very prone to falling for the sort of siren appeal of an independent who'll say, well, make the seat really marginal, then they'll pay you a lot of attention. You've got to mount the argument that you're there creating a bigger, stronger, better Australia for all Australians. You really have to, because it's tough for the National Party in many ways. I don't want to cry poor, but the demographics are moving against us. It's not that our rural areas are thinning out so much. It's that proportionately the cities and the urban areas of Australia just continue to expand. Mind you, COVID has led to an interesting shift back. I don't know what that might mean. But all our work showed that once a community got over about 5,000, a country town got over about 5,000, the attitudes in that town, the philosophical and political attitudes, mirrored, the big cities pretty much. So that sort of loss of bush flavour, which I regard as incredibly important and as part of the party's heritage, is something the party has to fight very hard to keep and to maintain and breathe as much oxygen into it for as long as it possibly can.
Can I ask you, and I'll turn to Mr. Howard in a moment, both of you have been in positions of having to prepare your parties and the ministries you led for the future. In other words, you've had the luxury, in a sense, of balancing experience with preparations for the future. In fact, not many governments have that opportunity. So when, Mr. Anderson, you were choosing ministers from your party, how did you encourage younger or newcomers to the ministry and send messages to more senior members that perhaps they should think about stepping back?
Well, it didn't happen very often because we had a pretty small team, to be frank.
Mm-hmm. If
I appointed or brought Warren Truss into cabinet because of his sheer ability, and I think he's been known ever since as a man who gets across his brief in a way that almost nobody else does. And he was a beacon of stability in times in coalition circles when there was a bit of instability around, and he very courageous and very steadfast sort of man. So that was sheer merit as far as I was concerned. But I've already alluded to the fact that when I did have to make some reductions, there was some real pain because they both, well, one disagreed very strongly with the choice I'd made, that I was sending a signal there, frankly, that youth, we needed to bring somebody a bit younger through, and that ability and work mattered. Don't know how successful I was in that. And then I made another appointment, which was to recognise the need to do more to recognise women, because funnily enough, organisationally, the party had always been in the vanguard of women in politics, but we hadn't translated it quite so much into seats and particularly senior ministry roles. So I tried to take that into account, but it was never easy. And one thing that's been left out of this is that one very capable, very likeable man with perhaps a different take on a lot of policy issues was terribly disappointed when Tim didn't have room for him in the ministry, and extremely disappointed, even more so, I think, when I took the same view some years later. So it can be very tough, especially in a small family type party like the National Party.
Yes, understood. Mr. Howard, can I turn to you for a response to that? How do you transition people in and out of ministries nicely?
Well, there was a lot of natural turnover in the Liberal side of the government. And in the first 5 years, two of the people who were really very influential right at the beginning, Peter Reith and Michael Woolridge. Reith as in IR and right at the end defence, done a fantastic job. He retired at the 2001 election. Michael Woolridge, who'd been an outstanding health minister, he retired at the same election. So there was a sort of a churn. We had quite a number of ministerial changes, and of course, there was from time to time reference to a very long-serving member of the government about his future. But that, of course, is another matter. Well, it's not really another matter, but it's been debated, and I don't mind it being debated again. But I was very conscious to promote people of ability, no matter how short a time they'd been in Parliament. I remember after the election that brought both Malcolm Turnbull and Andrew Robb into Parliament. One of them would later become Prime Minister, and one of them would be a very, very successful trade minister. I made them parliamentary secretaries right at the beginning. And I remember in a discussion I had with somebody who rejected the idea of being a parliamentary secretary, I reminded them that the first jobs held by Brendan Nelson and Tony Abbott and Malcolm Turnbull in my government have been parliamentary secretaries, and 3 of them have gone on to lead the party. 2 of them have become prime ministers. So you have to do that, but equally you've got to hang on to people who may have a lot of experience, but who continue to do a really first-class job. But there was a natural churn. Ian McLaughlin was another one who, after the Defence Minister, he volunteered. He came to see me and said, "Look, I only ever wanted to hold this job for a couple of years. I want to retire." So you are presented from time to time with a natural churn. That was my experience, and I didn't really experience a widespread situation where a whole lot of people who wanted to remain minister for something or other for 20 years had been appointed to a position, and they were absolutely moved. Another one, sadly through ill health, was John Fay, who'd been a fantastic and effective finance minister and a great partner to Peter Costello in getting the budget cleaned up and economic policy generally. And he retired. So I had that natural churn that avoided some of the difficulties implicit in the question you asked me.
Mr. Howard, we're coming, and Mr. Anderson, we're coming to the end of our session, and I just wanted to ask you a very quick question about how you might summarise the coalition relationship. If this conference, for example, were to have a brief subtitle under the coalition that might sum up the experience or the feel of the coalition during the Howard years, what, in your view, should that subtitle be?
Well, I would call it a remarkably successful partnership of people with common values and a shared determination to do the right thing by the country, but also having an eye to remaining in power, because you can't implement your common values without being in power.
Well, thank you, Mr. Howard. Mr. Anderson, how would you respond?
Juniors, and because John Howard and I don't think he'd mind me saying this, we're not all that far apart philosophically. I sometimes got attacked, and still do. "Oh, you were too close to the Liberals, you know, why didn't you have more arguments?" To which I respond now, having thought about it for many years, look, I can think of 4 distinct occasions when John Howard and I had very differing views on a particular issue, and each of them were resolved the way they ought to be, between civilised people in a civilised way, and we went out and presented a united front. And that is my position. That's the answer I give. And if they press, I say, "What do you want me to do? What did you want me to do?" Disagree with somebody who essentially I agreed with on the direction of the government and who was very kind to the bush. But I think my subtitle would be "The Triumph of Trust," because I think that's the word that to me most encapsulates why in the end it all worked.
Well, thank you. It's been good to talk with you both. Unfortunately, we've come to the end of this session. We now move on to our virtual morning tea, so please go and get a cup of tea. The next session will begin at 11:30 a.m. So please return to the conference homepage, click on the sessions to be presented by Professor Murray Good. Thank you and goodbye. Thank you both.